"You're not sick, sir. Your wife is slowly poisoning you." The little girl's whisper cut through the low hum of the charity gala like a jagged blade. Louis M. Porter stood in the center of the grand ballroom, the crown jewel of the city he had ruled with an iron fist for 2 decades. His tailored black suit and the tattoos peeking from his collar still commanded respect, but his trembling hands told a different story. For 6 months, a mysterious ailment had been draining the life from him, leaving the city's most feared man a hollow shell that even the most expensive specialists couldn't explain. To a man who had survived hits and federal indictments, this slow, invisible decline felt like a pathetic way to die. He leaned heavily on the arm of his wife, Cleo F. Gonzalez. In her shimmering red dress, she looked every bit the devoted partner, her face a mask of worried elegance as she navigated him through the crowd. It was as they neared the balcony that a small shadow slipped past the wall of security. A girl, barely 7 years old in a worn blue hoodie, appeared in front of them. She didn't look at the guards or the opulence of the room. Her brown eyes, sharp and unervingly serious, were locked onto Louis. "You look like you're fading away, Mr. Porter," Carol Ingram said, her voice steady despite the chaos of the party. Louis stopped, a sudden spike of alarm piercing through his brain fog. Before he could speak, Cleo stepped forward, her hand tightening on his arm as she flashed a tight, uneasy smile. "I'm sorry, little one, but my husband is very unwell and needs his rest," Cleo said, her tone sharp as she tried to usher the girl away. But Carol didn't flinch. She leaned in, her small hand shielding her mouth as she delivered the truth that would shatter Louis's world. The intensity in her gaze was far too heavy for a child. It was the look of someone who had seen a monster and lived to tell the tale. The gala had become a blur of suffocating perfume and predatory smiles, but Carol's whisper remained sharp, carving a path through Louis's clouded mind. That night, the walk back to their sprawling estate was silent. Cleo moved with her usual grace, her hand a warm, steady weight on his arm, a weight that now felt like a shackle. When they reached the kitchen, the familiar ritual began. Cleo prepared a late-night bowl of organic bone broth, her movements fluid and practiced. "The doctor said you need the nutrients, Louis," she murmured, her voice like honey masking a sting. She placed the bowl before him, her eyes searching his for a flicker of the weakness she had cultivated. For the first time in 6 months, Louis didn't see a devoted caregiver. He saw a hunter. "I'm not hungry, Cleo." The gala, the noise was too much, he lied, his voice gravelly and forced. He watched her expression. For a fraction of a second her mask slipped, a tightening of the jaw, a flash of irritation in her blue eyes, before the feigned concern returned. "Just a few sips, darling. For me." Later, he insisted, sliding the bowl away. As soon as she retired to her wing of the house, Louis didn't go to bed. He waited until the silence of the mansion was absolute, then he stood. His legs felt heavy, and his hands shook with the tremors that had become his constant companions. He carried the bowl to the large potted fern in the corner of his study and poured the liquid into the soil. The next morning, he skipped the recovery smoothie she brought to his bedside, claiming his stomach was in knots. By lunch, he did the same with the salad she prepared, surreptitiously dumping it into the waste bin in his private office while she was distracted by a phone call. By late afternoon, the change began. It started in his hands. For months, he hadn't been able to hold a pen or a glass without a rhythmic, humiliating vibration. But as he sat at his mahogany desk, he looked down and saw his fingers resting still against the leather surface. The fog that had lived behind his eyes, making every thought feel like it was dragging through silt, began to lift. He stood up, expecting the usual wave of vertigo that forced him to grab the furniture for support. It didn't come. Instead, a surge of raw, cold clarity rushed through his veins. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. The lights of Crescent Bay were no longer smears of hazy yellow, they were sharp, distinct diamonds. His strength was returning, and with it, a terrifying realization. The sickness wasn't an act of God or a failure of his body, it was a calculated murder. Every loving meal Cleo had served was a measured dose of his own demise. He heard the soft click of the door. Cleo entered, carrying a tray with a fresh cup of tea. "How are you feeling, Louis?" "You look different," she said, her voice dropping an octave as she stepped into the light. Louis turned to face her, careful to keep his posture slumped, hiding the newfound steadiness in his limbs. He looked at the woman he had married, the woman who was currently watching him die, and felt a coldness more profound than any he had ever known. "I feel," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with a predator's focus, "exactly how I'm supposed to." The chill of the mansion's air conditioning felt like a second skin as Louis sat in the shadows of his study, watching the door Cleo had just exited. The steadiness in his hands was no longer a relief, it was a weapon. But as his body recovered, his mind snagged on the image of the girl from the gala. Carol. A child who looked like she belonged in a playground, not whispering death sentences to men who ruled from thrones of blood. He reached for his secure phone, his fingers moving with a precision that felt foreign and exhilarating. He dialed a number that few had, connecting him to Marco, his most clinical and efficient tracker. "The girl from the gala," Louis said, his voice dropping into the low, resonant growl that had been absent during his months of sickness. "The one in the blue hoodie. Blue eyes, brown hair. I want everything. Where she sleeps, who she belongs to, and why she was there tonight. And Marco, keep it quiet. My wife is not to know we're looking." The wait was the hardest part. As the hours ticked toward dawn, Louis paced the room. He felt like a ghost returning to a body that had almost been cremated. He thought of his reputation, the butcher of the bay, a man whose name caused veterans of the underworld to lower their voices. He was a monster by every definition of the word. Why would a child, an innocent who should have been terrified of his very shadow, risk everything to save him? The logic of the streets was transactional, but there was no profit in helping a dying mafia boss. By sunrise, Marco's voice crackled through the encrypted line. "Her name is Carol L. Ingram. 7 years old. She lives in a tenement on the edge of the Iron District, 3rd floor, end of the hall. She lives with her mother, Samantha, who's working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. No father in the picture. He was one of ours, Louis. Jimmy the Ghost Ingram. He disappeared 4 years ago after that botched handoff in the docks. We dropped them, boss. Cut them off completely." The revelation hit Louis harder than any physical blow. Jimmy Ingram had been a loyal soldier, a man Louis had forgotten as easily as a spent shell casing. He had left the man's family to rot in the gutters of the city he controlled. "Why did she do it, Marco?" Louis asked, looking at his reflection in the dark window. He looked older, the lines of his face etched by poison and betrayal. "Kids see things, boss. Word on the street is she's been hanging around the kitchen staff at the gala, looking for scraps. She probably saw Cleo with the vials. But as for why she told you," Marco hesitated. "Maybe she just didn't want to see another person disappear." Louis hung up, the silence of the room suddenly deafening. He had spent his life building a fortress of fear, believing it was the only thing that could protect him. Yet, when the walls were closing in from the inside, it wasn't his soldiers or his wealth that had reached through the dark. It was a child he had abandoned, wearing a faded blue hoodie, who had decided that even a monster deserved a chance to fight back. He felt a strange, uncomfortable tightening in his chest, a spark of something that wasn't rage or survival. It was a debt. And in Louis's world, debts were always settled. The following evening, the mansion felt less like a home and more like a laboratory where Louis was the specimen. To the casual observer, he was still the fading lion. He walked with a slight limp and allowed his eyelids to droop, projecting the image of a man whose spark was nearly extinguished. But behind that mask, his mind was a razor, cutting through the domestic illusion Cleo had spent months perfecting. He had spent the afternoon hidden in the server room, a reinforced vault beneath the library that Cleo never visited. With the help of a trusted technician who had been sworn to a silence that carried the weight of a death threat, Louis had installed a pinhole camera in the kitchen's crown molding. It was positioned perfectly, angled to capture the marble island where Cleo prepared his nightly medicinal tea. Louis sat in the dark of the vault, the blue light of the monitors casting sharp shadows across his tattooed face. On the screen, the kitchen was bathed in the warm, amber glow of the sunset. Cleo entered the frame. She looked radiant, her blonde hair catching the light as she moved with a rhythmic, almost dance-like grace. She began to boil the water, her hands steady, far steadier than her husband's had been for half a year. Then, the sound came through the speakers. She was humming. It was a low melodic tune, the lullaby of the moon, a song she used to sing to him when they first married, back when he believed her devotion was his greatest asset. The sweetness of the melody made the hair on Louis's arms stand up. It was the sound of a woman at peace with a murder in progress. He watched as she reached into the back of a spice cabinet, pulling out a small unlabeled glass vial. She didn't look hurried. She didn't look guilty. With the precision of a chemist, she uncapped the vial and counted exactly 5 drops into his porcelain cup. The liquid was perfectly clear, disappearing instantly into the dark tea leaves. She swirled the cup gently, her eyes fixed on the vortex, her humming never faltering. She even took a moment to wipe a tiny invisible droplet from the counter with her thumb, licking it clean with a terrifying nonchalance. Louis felt a coldness settle in his marrow that no poison could induce. It was one thing to be told of a betrayal, it was another to witness the intimacy of it. She wasn't just killing him, she was officiating his slow disappearance with a smile. She picked up the tray, checked her reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator, and adjusted a stray lock of hair before heading toward the study where she expected to find her dying husband. Louis stared at the empty screen for a long beat, the hum of the lullaby still echoing in his ears. The debt he owed the girl in the blue hoodie grew heavier in that moment. Without her, he would have continued to drink from that cup, thanking his executioner with every sip. He stood up, his strength fully returned, fueled now by a cold, righteous fury. He had seen enough. The sickness was over, and the hunt had officially begun. The following morning, Louis didn't wait for the sun to crest over the skyline before summoning Elias, his lead forensic accountant and a man who could find a single missing cent in a hurricane. They met in the sub-basement vault, a cold concrete room far beneath the lush carpets and poisoned tea of the upper floors. "I told you to look for anomalies, Elias," Louis said, his voice now steady and lethal, stripped of the feigned exhaustion he wore like a shroud in Cleo's presence. "Tell me how much of my life she's already packed into a suitcase." Elias adjusted his glasses, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. He spread a series of wire transfer receipts and shell company registrations across the steel table. "It's worse than simple theft, Louis. It's a liquidation. Over the last 4 months, coinciding exactly with the onset of your illness, Cleo has moved approximately $12 million out of the primary holding accounts." Louis looked at the numbers, but he didn't see currency, he saw the price tag Cleo had placed on his head. "Where is it going?" "Cayman accounts, mostly," Elias explained, tapping a finger on a recurring name. "But the trail doesn't end with her. The accounts are co-signed by a holding firm based in Chicago." I dug into the board of directors. One name kept appearing behind a curtain of proxies: Victor Rossi. The name hit Louis like a physical strike. Rossi was the head of the North Side Syndicate, a man Louis had fought for control of the docks for a decade. Rossi was more than a rival, he was a vulture who had been waiting for the Porter Empire to show a single crack. "She isn't just stealing," Louis whispered, the realization settling in his gut like lead. "She's selling the keys to the kingdom." "There's more," Elias added, sliding a final document forward. "It's a maritime contract. A private yacht, the Vesper, has been fueled and cleared for departure from a private slip in 3 nights. The destination is international waters, then a straight shot to a villa in Amalfi. The passenger manifest lists 2 names, Cleo Gonzalez and Victor Rossi." Louis stared at the document, the widow's escape laid bare in black and white. Cleo wasn't just waiting for him to die, she was actively coordinating the transition of his power to his greatest enemy, ensuring that the moment his heart stopped, Rossi would be there to claim the throne, and the queen. She had turned his impending death into a business merger. A cold, calculated fury replaced the shock. He realized now that every kiss she gave him, every get-well card, and every drop of poison was a calculated step toward a life built on his grave. She had traded 10 years of marriage for a seat at Rossi's side and a mountain of laundered cash. "Keep monitoring the accounts," Louis commanded, standing tall, his silhouette imposing against the gray walls. "Don't block the transfers. Let her think the vault is wide open. If she wants to play the grieving widow, I'm going to make sure she has something real to grieve." He left the vault, his mind already drifting to the girl in the blue hoodie. Carol had given him the map to this betrayal. Now, he had the evidence to ensure it was the last map Cleo would ever use. The following afternoon, the air in the Porter estate felt heavy with the scent of lilies and deception. Louis played his part with the precision of a seasoned stage actor. He allowed his knees to buckle slightly as he crossed the foyer, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He made sure Cleo was watching from the top of the marble staircase, her eyes tracking his every tremor like a hawk watching a dying rabbit. When dinner was served, Louis took his seat at the head of the mahogany table, the very seat Rossi intended to occupy within the week. Cleo placed a steaming bowl of risotto in front of him, her touch lingering on his shoulder with a tenderness that made his skin crawl. "You look so pale today, Louis," she whispered, her voice a practiced flute of sorrow. "Eat. You need your strength." Louis picked up the spoon, his hand shaking violently, a controlled performance of the neurological decay she had worked so hard to achieve. He lifted a small portion to his lips, then suddenly let the silver utensil clatter against the porcelain. He gasped, clutching his chest, and allowed himself to slide out of the chair. He hit the floor with a dull thud, his body convulsing in a choreographed seizure. "Louis! Oh God, Louis!" Cleo's voice was a frantic shriek, but as he lay there, peering through slitted eyes, he saw her true reaction. She didn't reach for her phone to call an ambulance. She didn't check his pulse. Instead, she stood over him for 3 long seconds, her face terrifyingly blank, ensuring he was sufficiently incapacitated before she sprinted toward his private study. Louis remained motionless on the cold floor, listening. The house was silent enough that he could hear the frantic tapping of a touchscreen in the next room. He had already tapped the study's landline and his own encrypted network. Everything she did now was being fed directly into the server room where Elias waited. "It's happening," he heard her hiss into a phone, her voice stripped of its honeyed veneer. "He just collapsed. It's a massive seizure, Victor. The doctors said the heart wouldn't take another one. Move the departure up to tonight. I want the Vesper ready by midnight. I'm bringing the bearer bonds and the ledger." She paused, listening to Rossi's response. "No, don't send your men yet," she snapped. "I'll call the family doctor to pronounce him. Once the body is moved to the funeral home, we leave. There won't be an autopsy, I've already paid for the cremation papers. Just be at the dock." She hung up, the silence returning to the hallway. Louis felt a dark, cold satisfaction settle in his chest. By forcing her hand, he had made her admit to the timeline, the co-conspirator, and the theft of the ledger, the ultimate record of his organization's secrets. He heard her footsteps returning, the sound of her forced sobs beginning again before she even reached the dining room door. As she dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she feigned a panic attack, Louis kept his eyes closed. He let her weep over his dying body, knowing that the next time he opened his eyes for her, it would be to preside over her own professional and personal funeral. The act was over, the trap was set. The clock on the mantel chimed 11, its steady rhythmic beat sounding like a countdown to an execution. Louis sat at the head of the dining table, his back straight, his eyes clear for the first time in half a year. He had told Cleo he felt a miraculous surge of energy following his collapse, a final burst of life that he insisted on celebrating with a private toast before they retired. Cleo stood by the sideboard, her back to him. She was already dressed in a dark traveling suit, though she draped a silk robe over it to maintain the charade. He watched her through the reflection in a silver serving tray as she uncorked a bottle of vintage Bordeaux. Her movements were hurried now, fueled by the adrenaline of her impending escape. She poured 2 glasses, her hand hovering over one for a split second, the familiar clinical drop of the vial hitting the liquid. She turned, carrying the tray with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "To your health, Louis," she murmured, placing the tainted glass directly in front of him. "It's a miracle you're sitting up." "It is indeed," Louis said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He picked up his glass, swirling the dark red liquid. "But before we drink, I want to thank you, Cleo. For the months of care. For the tea. For the way you've managed my affairs while I was indisposed." Cleo's smile flickered. "You don't have to thank me. I'm your wife." "Exactly." Louis reached out, his hand moving with a speed and steadiness that made Cleo gasp. He didn't take a sip. Instead, he gripped the base of her glass and firmly slid his glass toward her, taking hers in return. The switch was deliberate, slow, and undeniable. The silence that followed was deafening. Cleo stared down at the glass in front of her, the glass she had just poisoned. Her face went from a pale porcelain to a sickly, ashen gray. "Drink, Cleo," Louis commanded. The sick man was gone. In his place sat the boss, the man who had built an empire on the corpses of those who thought they were smarter than him. "Louis, I'm not thirsty," she stammered, her voice rising in a frantic pitch. She reached for the glass, her fingers trembling so violently the wine splashed against the rim. "Drink it," he repeated, leaning forward into the candlelight. "Tell me it's just vitamins. Tell me it's the medicine the doctors prescribed. If there's nothing in there but wine, show me. Prove that the girl in the blue hoodie was a liar." At the mention of the girl, Cleo's composure shattered. She looked at the door, then back at Louis's cold, predatory eyes. She knew then that the Vesper would never sail for her. Victor Rossi wasn't coming to save her. How long? She whispered, the mask finally falling away to reveal the cold, calculating woman beneath. Long enough to see the lullaby you hum while you kill me, Louis said, standing up. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. The accounts are frozen, Cleo. The yacht has been seized. And the police are waiting in the foyer. Cleo looked at the wine, then at the man she had tried to erase. She didn't drink. She simply sat there, a prisoner in her own red dress, as the sound of heavy boots echoed down the hallway to take her away. The echoes of the police sirens had barely faded from the driveway before Louis stood in the center of his private warehouse, a cavernous space of cold concrete and humming industrial lights. He was flanked by the few soldiers whose loyalty had been vetted by Marco over the last 48 hours. Across from him stood 4 men, coppos and lieutenants who had served him for years. Men who had been seen on surveillance footage meeting with Victor Rossi's couriers, while Louis was allegedly dying in his bed. The air in the warehouse was thick with the scent of oil and fear. Normally, this was the moment Louis felt a surge of cold adrenaline. In the old days, the butcher of the bay would have already reached for the silver-plated revolver tucked into his waistband. He would have made an example of them, ensuring the concrete floor was stained deep enough to serve as a warning for the next generation. You thought I was a corpse, Louis said, his voice flat and terrifyingly calm. You watched my wife pour poison into my tea and you started measuring the drapes for your new offices. The oldest of the men, a grizzled veteran named Silvio, began to stammer. Louis, we didn't know. She told us the doctors said it was over. We were just trying to protect the interests of the family. You were protecting your seat at Rossi's table, Louis barked, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Marco stepped forward, laying a row of heavy zip ties and a dull blade on a folding table. It was the traditional preamble to a purge. The soldiers shifted, expecting the order to begin the grim work. Louis looked at Silvio's face. The man had been at Louis's wedding. He looked at the others, men he had shared bread and blood with. He reached for the weapon at his hip, but as his fingers brushed the cold steel, his mind didn't go to the betrayal. It went to the girl in the blue hoodie. He thought of Carol, sitting in a dark tenement, surviving on scraps because the family had discarded her. He thought of the way she had looked at him, not with the terror people usually reserved for a mafia boss, but with a strange, desperate hope. For the first time in 20 years, the weight of the gun felt wrong. The violence felt like a language he no longer wanted to speak. If he killed these men tonight, he would be exactly the monster the world believed him to be. He would be the man who deserved to be poisoned. Get out, Louis said quietly. The warehouse went deathly silent. Marco looked at him, confused. Boss. Take their cars. Take their phones. Strip them of their rank and exile them from Crescent Bay, Louis commanded, his voice growing stronger. If I see any of you within city limits after sunrise, the old Louis will come back to find you. But tonight I'm done with the blood. As the traitors were dragged out, stumbling in their haste to escape with their lives, Louis walked to the warehouse door and looked up at the stars. His hands were steady, his vision was clear, but his heart felt heavy with a new kind of burden. He had cleaned his house of enemies, but the empty rooms felt cold. He realized then that revenge was a hollow victory. Redemption, however, required something much more difficult than pulling a trigger. It required a purpose. And he knew exactly where to find it. The Iron District was a place where the sun seemed to lose its strength, filtered through the soot of the factories and the shadows of crumbling brick. Louis moved through the narrow alleyways with Marco a few paces behind him. He wasn't wearing his tailored suit, he had opted for a plain black coat, trying to blend into the grayness, yet he still felt like a foreign object in this landscape of struggle. They reached the tenement Marco had identified. The air in the stairwell smelled of boiled cabbage and damp concrete. When they reached the 3rd floor, Louis stood before the scarred wooden door of 3C. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the wood. He had faced down federal agents and rival lords without a tremor, but his heart hammered against his ribs at the prospect of facing a 7-year-old girl. He knocked. A moment later, the door creaked open, held by a safety chain. A woman looked out, Samantha, her face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. Her eyes widened as they landed on Louis. She didn't see a savior, she saw the man whose symbol was tattooed on the neck of the thugs who had terrorized her neighborhood. We paid this month, she whispered, her voice trembling. Please, we don't have anything else. I'm not here for money, Louis said, his voice softer than he knew it could be. I'm here to see Carol. The door opened fully, and there stood the girl in the blue hoodie. She looked smaller here, framed by a peeling kitchen table and a flickering fluorescent bulb. She didn't look afraid. She simply nodded, as if she had been expecting him. Louis stepped into the cramped room, his eyes scanning the space. On a small shelf near the window sat a framed photograph, dusted but faded. It was a man in a leather jacket, smiling broadly with a younger Samantha. Louis felt the floor tilt beneath him. "Jimmy," he breathed. "He worked for you," Samantha said, her voice turning sharp with a sudden protective anger. "Jimmy Ingram. He gave you 10 years of his life. And when he went missing at the docks, you didn't just lose a soldier. You deleted us. No pension, no protection. Just a notice that we were no longer the family's concern." Louis stared at the photo of Jimmy the Ghost Ingram. He remembered the man now, a quiet, reliable driver who never asked for much. When Jimmy had disappeared during the Rossi skirmish, Louis had authorized the cutting of ties to trim the fat of the payroll while he dealt with the fallout. He had sentenced this woman to 3 jobs and this child to scavenging for scraps at galas. He looked at Carol. She had known who he was. She had every reason to watch him die, to let Cleo's poison finish what his neglect had started. Instead, she had saved him. "Why?" Louis asked, his voice breaking. "Why save me after what I did to your father?" Carol walked over and placed a small thin hand on his steady arm. "Because my dad said you were a good man once," she whispered. "And I thought if you lived, maybe you could be a good man again." Louis sank into a rickety wooden chair, the weight of his sins finally crushing the boss out of him. He didn't just owe her a thank you. He owed her a life. He realized then that his empire wasn't a kingdom, it was a graveyard. And it was time to start building something else. The transition of the Porter Empire didn't happen with a bang, but with the scratching of a fountain pen against thick parchment. In the weeks following the confrontation in the Iron District, Louis M. Porter systematically dismantled the life he had built on fear. He didn't flee, he negotiated. He used his remaining influence to ensure a peaceful handover of his legitimate assets to a trust, and he burned the bridges to his illegitimate ones, leaving his rivals with nothing but empty warehouses and ghost accounts. A year later, the sprawling mansion that once felt like a tomb was gone, replaced by a quiet estate on the outskirts of the city, a place with large windows and a garden that grew herbs instead of secrets. Louis stood on the porch, a cup of tea in his hand, real tea, made by his own fingers. His tremors were a distant memory, but the clarity he had gained remained. He watched as a school bus pulled up to the end of the driveway. Carol climbed down, her blue hoodie replaced by a neat school uniform, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She was laughing, her face full of the light that only a child who feels safe can carry. Behind her, Samantha stepped out of the house. She no longer wore the bone-deep weariness of the Iron District. Her eyes were bright, and she moved with a quiet confidence as she headed to the clinic where she now worked as an administrator, a job Louis had ensured was hers by merit, backed by the stability of the foundation he had established in Jimmy Ingram's name. "How was the test, Carol?" Louis asked as the girl ran up the porch steps. "I aced it," she beamed, sliding into a chair beside him. She looked at him, her gaze still far too knowing for her age, but the intensity had softened into affection. "You're reading that book again, aren't you?" Louis looked down at the biography in his lap. "It's good to catch up on the world, Carol. I spent too long looking at it through a narrow lens." He was no longer the butcher of the bay. To the world, he was a retired businessman whose health had taken a turn for the better. To the syndicate, he was a ghost they dared not provoke. But to the girl sitting beside him, he was simply the man who had kept his promise. He had traded his throne for a porch swing and his soldiers for a family he had once tried to erase. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the garden, Louis realized that the little girl's whisper in the gala hadn't just saved his life, it had given him a reason to live one. The poison was gone, the debts were paid, and for the first time in his 60 years, Louis M. Porter was at peace. He reached out and ruffled Carol's hair, a simple gesture of a man who had finally learned that true power wasn't found in what you took from the world, but in what you protected.